The reading is from Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 34. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered round him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed round him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned round in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering."
While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat.
Some years ago, I was confronted with the news that our eldest daughter was seriously ill. And I still remember what a shattering experience that was. In that moment, you feel absolutely desperate. There's nothing that you won't do to try and help her. And yet, there's absolutely nothing you can do. Now, as it happened, in our case, it turned out to be a misdiagnosis. But those couple of weeks are ones that I don't think I will ever forget. So I can understand something of how Jairus might have felt when he came running to the waterside the moment that Jesus arrived in a boat, and in front of everyone just fell to his knees and begged Jesus to save his daughter. And he was the ruler of the local synagogue, a person of some significance in the local community. And in that society of deference in which these stories take place, rulers of synagogues don't make a show of themselves by running up to complete strangers and falling on their knees and begging for their help. But Jairus was desperate as Jesus' disciples had been just a few hours earlier when they had been caught in a storm, and they'd woken Jesus up from sleeping in the stern of the boat because they were afraid for their lives. And so now, in this story, once again, Jesus is confronted by the needs of those who are begging him to save them. And Jesus sets off, no doubt urged by Jairus, whose desperation will be growing minute by minute. So imagine, therefore, how Jairus must have felt when Jesus stops on his way and starts interrogating the crowd about who touched him. And we're told that the disciples are pretty dismissive about this. Look, you're surrounded by people. Loads of people have touched you. This was, of course, in the days before social distancing was even thought of. And you can imagine Jairus asking the same questions. What does it matter who touched you? She's healed. She's sorted. It's my turn now, Jesus. Come on. My daughter needs you. Why is Jesus bothering with this woman? A woman who Jairus, as ruler of the local synagogue, might well have played a role in pronouncing as ritually unclean because of her condition. An outcast, a nobody. Why on earth is Jesus wasting time with her when his need is so pressing? And then comes that dreaded news. The news that no father would ever want to hear. Don't bother this Jesus guy anymore. She's gone. She's dead. The situation is beyond hope. And here's this woman, restored, rejoicing, no doubt setting off in jubilation after being released from a lifetime of affliction and exploitation. And there's Jairus, destroyed by grief and despair. You know, when I sent Stephen the details of today's reading, I managed to type the numbers the wrong way around. And so I told him that it finished at verse 34 instead of verse 43. And so when I got the first recording of this, before Stephen added the rest on, that's where the story finished. And that would have been quite interesting, wouldn't it, if we had have finished the story there. And imagine what a desperate story it would have been if that was it. But of course, only desperate for Jairus. I mean, after all, Jesus has healed somebody, and if you look at the earlier story in the chapter, he's also healed somebody there on the other side of the lake too, and he stilled a storm. There's plenty to celebrate. There's plenty to get excited about in these stories. If we could just maybe take Jairus out of the picture and sideline him to the role of an extra, then there's plenty of positives to focus on. And it can be very easy and very tempting to develop a faith narrative by doing just that, focusing on the positives and sidelining those who struggle. In fact, that's exactly what Jairus is invited to do. Don't trouble the teacher any further, say the messengers from his house. Take yourself out of the story and leave the teacher to his successes. Come and join us in the mourning and the tears and the despair, and leave Jesus to others. But the story isn't over. And as you know, Jesus will go on to the house of Jairus, he'll dismiss the mourners, and he'll take Peter and James and John into the room with him, and he will raise her from the dead. But I want to invite you not to rush ahead yet, and to simply inhabit this story in this particular moment. When Jairus is confronted with his grief and his despair, when Jairus is invited to give up on Jesus, the moment in the story when Jairus or anybody but Jesus have no idea about how things are going to work out. Because yes, Jesus hasn't finished yet. But the Gospels were first written to the early Christians who were all too aware that their journey of faith was not yet complete. Christian communities who found themselves asking profound questions about what was going on around them. Christians who suffered persecution and hardship. Christians who'd witnessed some of their leaders being stoned and executed. Christians who would no doubt have asked questions as to why some people were wonderfully and marvellously restored and others weren't. That's the reality of the New Testament. The Acts of the Apostles tell us stories of how Paul is miraculously saved after he's been bitten by a poisonous snake, and yet of how Stephen is not saved when he's stoned to death, or how Peter was able to visit the house of Tabitha and pray for her to be restored from death. And yet we find Paul, writing to the church in Philippi, speaking of himself as being in chains and likely to be executed. Why would God save him from a snake bite, only to face execution through religious persecution? And we as God's people today might very often find ourselves asking similar questions. Why does God let this happen? Why does one person seem to receive an amazing outpouring of God's goodness and God's restoration, while someone else is left struggling? And as a pastor, I've found myself time and time again sitting alongside people as they wrestle with similar questions. People who would find it all too easy to identify with Jairus in that moment, as he received the news of his daughter's death, while Jesus was preoccupied with somebody else as far as he was concerned. Why would he, Jairus, after years of faithful service to his local synagogue, the upright religious leader, be neglected while an outcast woman is restored and healed? And let me say again, I know the story isn't over. I know what's going to happen next. But we are called to live in a world where the story isn't over, where God's kingdom has not yet fully come. So I sense that we have something to learn from inhabiting this moment while the story is not yet complete. And I'm not even saying that this episode from the Gospels contains all the answers, but I sense that it offers us some ways of recognizing this complicated and messy reality that life is. So I want to go back for a moment, first of all, to that storm on the lake that happened the first time that Jesus and his disciples crossed it, the storm that we read about in chapter 4. Because by now, as we come across this story in chapter 5, they've been over to the other side, and there's a whole episode there for us to get our heads around on another day. But now Jesus has come back. So they've crossed the lake. There's been no storm. There's been a safe and straightforward crossing. All their problems are solved. But as they land on the other side, they're confronted by someone else's storm, Jairus's. And if you joined our service last week, you may remember how Matt used that image of a storm to help us reflect on some of the storms that might have brewed in our lives. Not literal storms, but the storms of crisis that we all face. And I sense that there's something for us to consider here. Jesus has calmed the storm for his disciples. He's rescued them from peril. But here we're reminded that for every storm that we might expect Jesus to still, there'll be another one raging somewhere else, another one brewing on the horizon. And it's so easy for us to want Jesus to still our storm. But who else's storm does that exclude? And of course, Jesus invited those disciples in that moment of their crisis to have faith. Wasn't faith enough? Asks Jesus. And then here we find Jesus talking about faith again. This time to the woman who touched the hem of his garment. And she's commended for her faith, for believing that by touching his garment she'd be healed. Her storm had brewed for years, and she'd looked to all kinds of people to try and to still her anguish, but all that she'd found was that she'd been ripped off by quacks and medicine men and got worse. There's always money to be made out of other people's misfortune. So how come her faith is expressed through seeking release from her particular storm, and yet the disciples are rebuked for a lack of faith when they ask Jesus to still theirs? Now, you may feel that I'm reading too much into the story here, but take a look at the way in which Mark structures all of this, because he really does try to help us join all these episodes together. These are not just coincidental interruptions. For one thing, he frames everything around getting in and out of boats and crossing lakes. We're intended not to forget the story of the storm or the question that it raised, who is this man? Because once again, we're put onto the seashore with the boat. So as we look at the bigger narrative, you get into a boat and there's a storm, you get out of the boat and there's a storm, you go to one side of the lake and there's someone in desperate need, you go to the other side of the lake and there are more needs and more storms. And Mark also, in the way he tells the story, kind of instills in his reader something of Jairus' frustration by the way that suddenly this guy, who usually is really fast and pithy in his storytelling, begins to go into laboured detail about this woman's history. Now, there was a woman who'd been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She'd endured much under many physicians. She'd spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She'd heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." And he gives us all this detail, and we are still none the wiser as to what's going to happen. Come on, Mark, get on with it. Tell us what happened. Because as a storyteller, he helps us to sort of enter that sense of frustration that must have been brewing in Jairus. And then what does Jesus call this woman as he affirms her faith and pronounces his peace and his blessing? Daughter. Daughter. This is a story about daughters. Mark connects storms to storms and daughters to daughters as he weaves these stories together. And at the very moment when a woman whose condition would have stigmatized her as unclean and as an outcast from God's people, at that moment when she is reclaimed as a daughter of God, a religious leader receives the news that his daughter has been lost. And how long had this woman suffered? 12 years. For 12 years she'd been lost as a daughter. 12 years. And how old does Mark tell us that Jairus' daughter was in verse 42? 12. For 12 years Jairus had had a daughter, and now she was lost. For 12 years this woman was lost, and now she was a daughter. Now at this point you may well be tempted to just put YouTube on hold and go and have a lie down in a darkened room, because this is all getting very complicated, all these different stories as they kind of crash into one another. Faith is about not asking for help and trusting in the fact that Jesus is asleep. Faith is about pushing through the crowd and touching his garment in the hope and expectation of healing. And then what does Jesus say to Jairus? Don't be afraid, just believe. Just believe. Have faith. Faith is about trusting God in the waiting and following Jesus into whatever is going to happen next. Faith is about shrugging off the laughter of the mourners as they tell you that you're crazy to believe that she's only asleep. How can faith be all these different things? Why do we have to make it so complicated? Because life is complicated. And because while we are dealing with one storm, a completely different storm is raging for someone else. That is what our world is like. Because some storms blow up in a moment, like the storm on the lake, and other storms rage and rage for years, like this woman's condition. Because as one storm is stilled, another one blows up on us. Yes, it's complicated, but it feels very much like the reality that I find myself in an awful lot of the time. And it's interesting to also pause and to look at this from each different person's perspective. The disciples might look at the woman and say, well, how come when she asks for help, Jesus declares that she's got faith, and when we ask for help in the storm, he criticizes us for not having faith? Or Jairus might look at the woman and say, well, how come he's so concerned to engage with her while my daughter is left to die? And even the woman, at the end of the story, when Jesus has raised Jairus' daughter, let's face it, we know that's going to happen. Stephen's already told us that in the reading. And the moment she becomes ill, the moment this little girl becomes ill, Jesus steps in there and then and heals her. But what about the woman? And the 12 years that she'd lost, the dignity that she'd lost, the money that she'd lost, the opportunities that would have passed her by, the humiliation, the stigma that she had endured. Why had God kept her waiting for 12 years? Now, I don't know the answer to any of those questions. But as a Christian minister, I hear people asking questions like them all the time. And in the midst of all these conflicting and contrasting experiences and expectations and hopes and fears, Jesus turns to Jairus and says, don't be afraid, believe. Because Jesus hasn't finished yet. And Jesus is in control of events. Even when a woman tries to quietly touch his garment and slip away into the crowd, Jesus will have none of it. No, I'm the one who will control this narrative, he says. Come and talk to me. Let's talk about your faith and your healing. And so Jairus is faced with a choice. Do I listen to Jesus? Or do I listen to those rational, realistic voices who are saying to me, don't trouble Jesus anymore? He's let the chance go. He hasn't delivered to our timetable. Game over. And those voices of reason are reinforced through the laughter of the mourners as they mock Jesus for saying that she's only asleep. But nothing is impossible for God. And just as Sarah, the wife of Abraham, was proved wrong when she laughed at God's proposition that she would have a child thousands of years earlier in their history, Jesus proves those laughing, mocking mourners wrong professional mourners, we are told, people who would be paid to organise a ceremonial time of lament, ready to take advantage of another's misfortune, just like those doctors who failed the bleeding woman. And Jesus says to this girl, Talitha kum, I say to you, arise. And she is restored to new life. And we are living in that place in God's purposes where Jesus is not yet finished. We're living in that place where Jairus found himself, surrounded by choices and expectations, able to catch a glimpse of the possibilities of God's kingdom, and yet still embroiled in fear and struggle. Even in that moment, when another's needs are placed above his own, as Jesus refuses to conform to the social hierarchies and put Jairus first, Jairus catches a glimpse through what Jesus does to that woman of the possibilities of God's kingdom. So does he focus on the woman and ask why her needs are seemingly placed before his? Or does he look to Jesus and renew his faith in the possibilities of God? And if he's going to focus on the woman, will it be an envious despair as she takes up the time that he felt he needed? Or will he be inspired by her faith so that he can respond positively when Jesus says to him, don't be afraid, believe? And in the midst of our confusion and questions, in the midst of our different experiences and expectations, Jesus says to us, don't be afraid, believe. Whether we're caught up in the same storm as everybody else, like a worldwide pandemic, or whether our storm is entirely different and simply exacerbated by the fact that everyone seems to be focused on something else. Whether, like that woman, we've sensed the miraculous transforming power of God, or whether we've been blessed and affirmed by the voice of acceptance that has declared us to be a child of God, or whether, like Jairus, we're left waiting and wondering what Jesus is going to do. Jesus says to us, don't be afraid, believe. Because as we've noted before, faith can be expressed in many ways and many circumstances in the here and now. But the day will come when God's kingdom will fully come. And each of us will hear that voice that echoed around a house of mourning in first century Palestine. I say to you, arise. Come and find your place in my kingdom. Come and claim your inheritance. Come and enter into the promise and the joy of eternity. Jesus has left us traces of evidence of his power even over death itself, so that we too can have faith to hold on in the midst of all the conflicting and confusing experiences of life. And each of us will be facing our own struggles. Each of us will no doubt be able to apply different aspects of our own experience to the various characters in this story. But the one reality that holds us all together is that Jesus hasn't finished yet. And in the midst of this messy, confusing, conflicting world, he offers us this simple but profound invitation. Don't be afraid. Believe. For the time is coming when you will hear those words. Son, daughter, little girl, old man, I say to you, arise. May God hold us fast until that day comes, and may we be faithful in bearing testimony to that eternal hope. Amen.